All right, so let's dive into Joshua 2, 1 to 1. Yeah, we're skipping the basic stuff, right? Our listeners already know that story backwards and forwards. We want to get into the meat of it, the stuff that'll really get those sermon prep wheels turning. What kind of unique perspectives can we find on this? We've got a ton of sermons and analyses here, and let me tell you, some pastors have some really interesting approaches.
Yeah. It's amazing to see how many different angles people are taking on this passage.
Yeah.
It really goes to show how much depth there is to uncover, even in the most familiar stories.
Okay, so one that really caught my eye was Pastor Kimberly Bolgen. She presents Rahab as this super independent woman, even going so far as to call her a pleasure palace owner,
Yeah.
which kind of flips the script on the traditional image of Rahab, right?
It definitely does. It makes you rethink things. It's a window into the social structures of that time. What did it mean for a woman in Rahab's shoes to be independent? Was she really defying the norms, or was she playing by a different set of rules? And how does that change the way we see her faith and her choices?
That's a really good point.
Ah,
And Bolgen digs even deeper. She looks at the original Hebrew word for lay there and suggests that there might have been a closer, more intimate connection between Rahab and the spies.
It's a bold interpretation, for sure. It definitely raises some interesting questions about how we interpret the Bible, especially when it comes to topics that can be a little sensitive. It highlights how important it is to understand the nuances of the original language and the historical context. It might make some people uncomfortable, but it pushes us to go beyond just a surface-level reading.
Yeah, it's like she's saying, hey, there's more to this story than you might think. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. We see a lot of pastors like those from Spring City Fellowship and Liberty Life Church focusing on that classic faith in action theme.
Yeah.
But they're not just skimming the surface. They're drawing some really interesting parallels between Rahab and the spies Moses sent out in Numbers 13. You know, the ones they doubted and ended up wandering for 40 years.
Oh, yeah. That comparison really brings the point home, doesn't it? It's not just about having faith. It's about the kind of faith you have and what it leads you to do. Rahab's faith wasn't passive at all. She saw a chance to align herself with God's plan, and she took it. And the results speak for themselves.
Absolutely. And I love how they don't shy away from that contrast.
Yeah.
It's a great reminder for anyone who might be wrestling with doubt or struggling to really live out their faith. Now, Prestonwood Baptist Church took a really interesting approach. They used the story of Chuck Colson, the Watergate figure, to illustrate God's transformative grace in Rahab's life.
That's such a clever connection. Both of them, Rahab and Colson, came from situations that seemed pretty hopeless, marked by their past choices. But through faith, they both found redemption. Colson went from this disgraced political figure to founding Prison Fellowship, which is a powerful ministry helping prisoners find hope and purpose in Christ. It just goes to show you that God's grace can reach anyone, no matter where they come from or what they've done.
It really makes you think about how one decision can lead to another, and suddenly your life takes a totally different turn.
Right. So Water's Edge Church goes in a totally different direction. They use this analogy of a Jeep
Oh, I love this one.
to explain how the Israelites had to learn to really own the Promised Land. It wasn't enough to just get there. They had to actively take possession of what God had given them.
It's such a great visual, especially for today's world. Everyone can relate to that feeling of taking ownership, of stepping into a new car and hitting the gas. They connect it beautifully to Rahab, saying that her faith allowed her to take hold of a new future, escape the destruction of Jericho, and become part of God's people. It's like a call to action in our faith. Don't just wait for God to do everything we have to be a part of it too. It's like they're saying, don't just let your faith sit there idle, put it in drive. And then you've got Fort Myers Community Church adding another layer. They describe Rahab as seemingly insignificant and use the butterfly effect. That whole idea that small actions can have massive rippling consequences to show how her choice to hide the spies ended up impacting the lineage of Jesus.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it. Here's this seemingly ordinary woman from a city steeped in paganism, and she becomes this pivotal figure in God's plan. It makes you wonder, what seemingly small acts of faith are we doing right now that could have a similar ripple effect down the line?
Yeah, it's like a reminder, hey, don't underestimate the power of your yes to God. So we're seeing Rahab as this smart businesswoman, a woman with incredible courage, a symbol of redemption. But there's another layer here that a lot of these sermons touch on. They point out that Rahab is praised for her faith in Hebrews 11. And get this, she's listed as an ancestor of Jesus in Matthew 1.5.
Wow.
Yeah.
It really is amazing. Out of all the women in history, Rahab, who some interpretations say was a prostitute in a pagan city, is part of Jesus' family tree. It really challenges our ideas about who God chooses to use.
It's a powerful reminder that God's grace doesn't have limits. He sees past our labels, our past choices, our social standing, and chooses to work through people who were willing to say yes to him.
And to illustrate that, Revival tab uses this beautiful analogy. They compare us to a crumpled $20 bill.
I love that one. It might be all wrinkled and worn, but it doesn't lose its value. It really drives home the point that our past mistakes don't change our worth in God's eyes. We can always be made new.
Yeah. It's a powerful image of redemption and new beginnings. No matter what we've done or how many times we've messed up, God sees our true value. Rahab's story encourages us to embrace those fresh starts and experience that same transformative power of faith that she did. It's a powerful image of redemption and new beginnings. No matter what we've done or how many times we've messed up, God sees our true value, and Rahab's story encourages us to embrace those fresh starts, to experience that same transformative power of faith that she did. And speaking of new beginnings, one thing that really struck me was how a lot of the sermons highlighted that contrast between Rahab's Jericho and the Promised Land, the one the Israelites were about to enter.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. What kind of insights were they drawing from that?
Well, Liberty Life Church really drove home the point that Jericho was like this city consumed by paganism and idolatry. It represented everything the Israelites were supposed to be leaving behind. But you have Rahab right in the middle of all that, recognizing the God of Israel as the one true God.
Yeah, it's like a picture of God's grace breaking into the most unlikely places. Her faith is so different from everything around her.
Exactly. And that's what makes her story so powerful for us today. I mean, we live in a world that can often feel just as hostile to faith as Jericho was. But Rahab reminds us that God is always working, even in the most unexpected places. He's drawing people to himself.
It's a call to be bold in our faith, even when it feels like we're surrounded by opposition. Another point that came up in a few of these sermons was the significance of that scarlet cord.
Ah, yes. The cord that Rahab hung from her window to signal her allegiance to the Israelites. It's become such a powerful symbol in Christian tradition.
It really has. But I'm curious to hear how these pastors are unpacking its meaning, for their congregations.
Well, a lot of them, like the pastor from Prestonwood Baptist Church, pointed to the scarlet cord as a foreshadowing of the blood of Christ. It represents salvation, protection from judgment. Just as the cord saved Rahab and her family from destruction, the blood of Jesus saves us from the consequences of our sin.
It's a beautiful connection, tying the Old Testament story to the New Testament fulfillment of God's plan.
And it highlights this key point. God's plan of salvation has been there from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Which brings us to another interesting point that several sermons touched upon the fact that Rahab is mentioned in Jesus' lineage in Matthew 1.5.
I know. It's incredible when you think about it.
Yeah.
Out of all the women in history, Rahab, this woman who was likely a prostitute in a pagan city, is included in the lineage of Jesus. Talk about a bold statement about the inclusiveness of God's grace.
It really challenges our assumptions about who's worthy of God's favor. It's not about our past mistakes or our social standing. It's about our faith and whether we're willing to align ourselves with God's will.
It's a powerful reminder that God can use anyone, regardless of their background, to accomplish his purposes.
And speaking of God's purposes, one sermon that stood out to me was from Fort Myers Community Church. They use this really interesting analogy of the butterfly effect to describe the impact of Rahab's actions.
Oh, I love the butterfly effect.
Yeah.
The idea that even seemingly small actions can have huge, unforeseen consequences.
Exactly. They argued that Rahab's choice to hide the spies, this seemingly small act of defiance, had a ripple effect that ultimately led to the birth of Jesus. It's a powerful illustration of how our choices, even the ones that seem insignificant, can have far-reaching implications.
It's a reminder that we're all part of a much bigger story, and our actions, no matter how small, can make a difference.
Absolutely. And it's a call to be mindful of the choices we make, to consider the potential consequences both for ourselves and for those around us. One thing I found particularly helpful, especially for those of us who are crafting sermons and Bible studies, was how many pastors explored the practical implications of Rahab's story for their congregations.
Yes, it's great to talk about the theological concepts, but how do we actually apply these truths to our lives? That's where the rubber meets the road.
Right. For example, Spring City Fellowship really leaned into the idea of faith in action. They challenged their listeners to consider how they were putting their own faith into practice, not just in words, but in deeds.
Which is crucial. It's not enough to just believe in God. We're called to live out our faith in tangible ways. And Rahab's story provides a powerful example of what that looks like. She didn't just say she believed in the God of Israel. She took a huge risk to protect his messengers.
And Water's Edge Church took a similar approach, emphasizing the importance of actively possessing the promises God has for us. They encouraged their congregation to step out in faith and take hold of the blessings God has in store, just like Rahab stepped out of her comfort zone and embraced a new future.
I love that emphasis on active participation. Faith is not a passive concept. It requires us to engage with God and to take steps of obedience, sometimes even risky steps. And then there's Revival Tab's message, which really hammered home the idea of fresh starts and the transformative power of faith. That's a message that resonates so deeply, especially in a culture that often tries to define us by our past mistakes.
Absolutely. It's a message that speaks to the very heart of the gospel: redemption, forgiveness, and new beginnings.
And isn't that what we all need to hear sometimes? No matter how many times we stumble or fall, God is always there to pick us up and give us another chance.
Speaking of second chances, one of the most creative approaches I saw was Speaking of second chances, one of the most creative approaches I saw was from Liberty Life Church. They actually used this modern analogy of, like tracking family members on your smartphone to illustrate the challenges those spies might have faced in Jericho.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
Yeah, they talked about how nowadays you can see where your kids are or, where your spouse is on a map. And then they asked the audience to imagine those spies trying to stay hidden in a city where everyone was on high alert, where every move they made could be tracked by Jericho's authorities.
It's such a great way to put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah.
To really feel that sense of danger and uncertainty.
Exactly. And it kind of reinforces that idea that even though they were surrounded by enemies, God was still watching over them.
It's a reminder that even when we feel like we're walking through hostile territory, God is with us. So as we were looking through these sermons, one question kept coming up for me. What about Rahab's past? She was, according to some interpretations, a prostitute in a pagan city. How do we reconcile that with her being held up as a woman of faith, even an ancestor of Jesus?
It's a question a lot of people struggle with, and it really gets at the heart of what grace and redemption are all about.
It really does. And several sermons address this head-on, emphasizing God's ability to transform lives no matter how messy or seemingly hopeless the starting point bidder. Prestonwood Baptist Church, for instance, made a powerful connection to the story of Chuck Colson.
Right. They reminded us that God's grace isn't limited by our past mistakes. Even someone as deeply involved in political corruption as Colson could find redemption and become a force for good in the world.
It's a powerful reminder that no one is beyond the reach of God's love and forgiveness. And Revival Tab's analogy of the crumpled $20 bill is so perfect in this context.
I know, right? That visual is so powerful. It drives home the point that our inherent worth doesn't diminish. Even if we've made mistakes or gone through incredibly difficult experiences, our value remains.
Exactly. And that's a message we all need to hear, especially in a culture that often tries to define people by their past, their failures, their labels. Rahab's story offers a powerful counter-narrative. It tells us that God sees potential where we might only see brokenness.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Joshua 2:1-1, what are some key takeaways for those who are preparing sermons or leading Bible studies? What fresh perspectives can they offer their audiences? What stood out to you?
Honestly, what struck me most was the sheer diversity of interpretations we encountered. It shows there's always more to discover in Scripture, even in passages we think we know well. We can approach the same text from multiple angles, and each perspective can yield new insights.
It's a call to stay curious, to keep digging, to not be afraid to challenge our own assumptions.
Absolutely. And this passage in particular is so rich with themes that resonate deeply with contemporary audiences. Faith, courage, redemption, God's relentless grace, the power of seemingly small actions, the radical inclusivity of God's love, it's all there.
And it's packed with powerful illustrations and analogies that preachers can use to bring those themes to life. We've got the scarlet cord as a symbol of salvation, the Jeep analogy for possessing God's promises, the butterfly effect, illustrating the impact of our choices, the crumpled $20 bill representing our unchanging worth in God's eyes. It's like a treasure trove of sermon material.
Those are images that can really stay with people long after the service is over.
They really are.
So for those of you listening who are working on messages about Joshua 2:1-1, I think the biggest takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to get creative. Dig deep. Explore different perspectives. Find ways to connect these ancient truths to the lives of your listeners in fresh, engaging ways. Rahab's story is a timeless testament to the transformative power of faith and the boundless reach of God's grace. It's a story that continues to speak to us today, offering hope, encouragement, and a challenge to live lives of courage and conviction.
And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Helping people encounter God's grace in a way that changes their lives.